Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members Teresa and Linda, are master gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature, or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
Hi, I'm Tim Kennelty.
And I'm Jean Thomas.
And welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. A really cool show with lots of stuff today, right?
It is. We've got nuggets of information instead of interviews.
There's a brilliant person starting, that would be me, talking about good plant, bad plant. I'm going to be talking today about one of my favorite native plants, Ironweed, which is not for the faint of heart. It's a beautiful, tall, purple flowering native plant that's great for pollinators. And then on the converse side, I'm going to be talking about the horrible barberry. I know a lot of people have barberry in their gardens. If you do, go out right now and dig it out because it's a bad invasive and it also attracts ticks.
And Tim's not being judgmental or anything.
I am being judgmental.
Well, then we talk about pests and pathogens, and we're going to discuss the wonderful world of rusts, which are diseases. Dede.
It's not like something on metal? It's not?
It
no?
can be, but
Okay.
doesn't have quite the same result.
Rusts are bad on plants,
Rusts
right?
are bad on plants, but you can spot them easily, as you can tell from the name.
And then last but not least is the inaugural episode of Patch to Plate. Annie Scibienski, our fellow podcaster, is doing a wonderful new segment on cooking with vegetables from your garden.
And Annie is a good cooker.
She is. We know this because she's feeding us all the time.
We whine at her until she brings things to the meetings.
We whine a lot. Yeah.
We do whine a lot.
Yeah, and she's talking about beets and carrots. So Teresa has talked to you about how to plant those and how to grow those, and now Annie's going to talk to you about how to cook them.
And they're taking them out from under the ground up into the plate.
I love carrots and beets.
Me too.
Yeah. So great show. We're going to eat carrots and beets after, right?
But of course.
Hi, and welcome back to Good Plant, Bad Plant, where we focus on 2 plants per episode, one that's ecologically valuable, and one plant on the other end of the spectrum that's invasive or noxious weed. Thus, Good Plant, Bad Plant. I'm your host, Tim Kennelty. Today I'm going to switch things up a bit because the good plant may be one that you've never heard of or haven't grown. But trust me, if you have some room and like bold plants, you're going to like this one. And the bad plant is one you probably do know because until recently it was being sold in garden centers and has been a regular feature in many people's landscapes. But my advice is don't ever plant it. And you may just want to think about getting rid of it if you do have it. Okay, big reveal. The good plant is Ironweed and the bad plant is Japanese Barberry. As always, let's start with the good guy. Ironweed is in the Asteraceae family, or the daisy family. There are quite a few different species of ironweed that are great candidates for your garden, especially if you're interested in supporting pollinators. So you may find Vernonia fasciculata, common ironweed, Vernonia gigantea, giant ironweed, and one that we see most in our area, Vernonia novaboracensis, New York ironweed. The biggest difference among these is really the size. New York ironweed can grow to a whopping 5 to 8 feet tall in a single season, with a profusion of small, brilliant purple blossoms in the late summer garden. Gigantea can get even bigger. The species Vernonia is named for the British botanist William Vernon, who collected plants in the New World in the 1600s. The plant most likely gets its common name, ironweed, from its constitution. It's a really tough plant, or more likely for its stem and root tissue. Carol Otteson in the Native Plant Primer recommends root divisions be made with an axe or a chainsaw. I actually moved some large plants last fall, and it was quite a chore. I used a pickaxe. So you probably know by now that I really like bold plants, and that's why ironweed is one of my favorites. With its impressive height and beautiful purple flowers appearing on the tops of the stems, this is a great plant for the back of the border. And it's a great plant to add some structure to your perennial bed. I've even seen it used as an allay or almost a maze in a beautiful display I visited a few years ago. And man, oh man, is it a pollinator plant. When it blooms in late summer to early fall, it's covered in both large and smaller butterflies as well as native bees. And the small seeds that develop in the fall are readily eaten by a variety of birds. This is a clump-forming plant that is not picky about soils. I've seen volunteers growing in gravel driveways, and it can take both wet and dry conditions provided it's planted in a sunny location. And if you're reluctant to spend a lot of money on perennials, know that this is a plant that reliably returns year after year and is relatively deer resistant. And if you like free plants, and really, who doesn't, ironweed is a prolific self-seeder. Just move the seedlings when they're small to a new location. Otherwise, getting all the root mass may be a challenge. I've started whole new areas of ironweed in my perennial beds with just a few wayward seedlings relocated in the spring. One more great thing about this plant is that you can reduce its height by cutting off the tops in late spring to early summer. This plant can take it and will even branch out more and may produce more flowers. That way you can have multiple ironweed plants at varying heights to even have more interest in your garden. So if you're a purple lover and want a really tough, bold pollinator plant, head to the V's in the perennial section of your nursery and pick up an ironweed for your garden. The bees, butterflies, and birds will thank you. And now for the bad plant, Japanese Barberry. If you've been gardening for a while or inherited an established garden, you probably know this plant and maybe even like it for its toughness. Japanese Barberry, or Berberis thunbergii, is thought to have been introduced to the United States in 1875 when seeds were sent from Russia to the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. The following year, it was planted in the New York Botanical Garden. It was subsequently promoted and planted as a substitute for Berberis vulgaris. That plant, common barberry, was brought to the New World by settlers in the 1600s, but was almost completely eradicated when it was found to be responsible for failing wheat crops. So we substituted one invasive plant for another. Japanese barberry is a deciduous shrub that can grow from 3 to 8 feet tall. It has small, alternate oval leaves in shades of green to bluish to burgundy, with simple spines along its stems. It has pale yellow blossoms in spring and bright red fruits that occur from July to October. The plant is drought resistant and can grow in a variety of soils in sun and shade. It spreads rapidly through seed dispersal from birds and can spread vegetatively through root creeping and tip rooting. So like many invasive shrubs, because of its rapid spread and lack of natural controls like deer, it can push out native vegetation and form monocultures. However, this is not the only problem with Japanese barberry. It's also been linked to deer ticks and Lyme disease. In areas with large populations of Japanese barberry, there can be a 90% increase in Lyme and related diseases carried by ticks. This is most likely because the plant is an excellent habitat for white-footed mice, the larval deer tick's host, providing cover and high humidity. Japanese barberry has been linked to invasive earthworms and increased soil erosion as well. As to management, smaller shrubs can be pulled in spring and fall when the soil is more moist. For larger infestations, you may also want to consider herbicides. If you have the plant as an ornamental specimen in your garden, I recommend removing it, and please don't compost it if it's fruiting, as you may cause further spread. Japanese barberry is prohibited from sale in New York State. I'll include links to identification and management on our website. All in all, a plant that you really don't want in your garden and an invasive that you want to manage to reduce or eliminate if possible in your landscape. So that's it for another edition of Good Plant, Bad Plant. And remember, as a gardener, you really can make a difference. If you want to support wildlife, plant natives.
You're listening to Nature Calls, conversations from the Hudson Valley. Stay tuned for Pests and Pathogens.
Hello and welcome back to this segment of Pests and Pathogens. We're Dede Terns-Thorpe and
Jackie Hayden.
We're Master Gardener Volunteers with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties. Today we'll be talking about rust. And no, not what happens when iron oxidizes, but a fascinating group of fungus diseases.
The mechanism that rusts use is unique. Most require two hosts from completely different families and alternate between them. The scientific description of them from the U.S. Forest Services is this: rusts are obligate parasites that depend on living cells and their hosts. Initially, they produce structures that grow into the host's living cell, from which they derive nutrients. They require that the host species be less than a mile apart and have from 2 to 5 stages of their life cycles.
So why are they called rusts anyway? Well, it's a descriptive thing. Cedar apple rust makes bright orange growths on the stems of juniper and eastern red cedar in the springtime, and orange or red leaf spots on the apple or the hawthorn leaves. White pine blister rust makes orange-yellow blisters on pine stems and orange spores with brown hair-like projections on the currants or the gooseberries.
Two of the most common in our area are cedar apple rust and white pine blister rust. Let's start with the cedar apple rust. This has 2 stages, one in cedars or Jupiters and the other in the ribes family, gooseberries and currants. In the spring, the galls produce bright orange fungal growths with projections. They look like tentacles, and they release their spores.
We've seen those. I always wondered what they were. The growths dry out over the summer and may dry out and rehydrate several times over a season. They only release the spores when it's wet weather, so infestations will vary with seasonal fluctuations. And where do the spores go? Well, the lucky ones land on trees like apple, hawthorn, and serviceberry. They don't thrive on any other kind of plant. You can tell they're there by the red to orange spots on the leaves. Red dots show up on the spots as the spores mature, and then little stubby tubes appear on the underside of the spots. These release their spores. The spores can only affect cedars or junipers, and they have to be within about a mile. Both types of spores are slow growing, so your best protection is just to keep an eye out for the first signs. That is, the red spots on apple family leaves and little galls on the cedars and junipers. Galls are certainly easier to spot when they grow those bright orange aliens. It's rare that you'll need to use a fungicide. If you do, read the label and remember that these plants are all important hosts to pollinators, which will be killed by the fungicide.
The other big rust problem is the white pine blister rust. This is another invasive problem. Its origins are in Asia, but not directly. Here's an interesting story. From Asia, the rusts were established in Europe as far back as the 1700s, in white pines from America. Then around 1900, European seedlings were brought back to America. By 1950, it was in almost all the commercial white pine regions. These are 5-needle pines. Pine species that have their needles in pairs are not affected. The problem is that the 5-needle species, eastern white pine, western white pine, and sugar pine, valuable for their timbers, are the ones that are affected.
The infection is sneaky, too. Branch cankers develop and take 1 or 2 years to produce spores. Sometimes the needles near the canker turn bright red, called a blister rust flag, but by then the disease is well established. Often the cankers bleed resin from the damage of the cankers, thus the blister part of the description. The host supports the first 2 of the 5 stages required for a full cycle, the pycnial and e-shield stages. These then infect the alternate host, the ribes family of gooseberry and currants. The uridenial and the teleal stages must develop on the ribes, and the 5th stage is the basidio, which develop from the teleospores. After the ribes are affected by the spores from the pines, the underside of the leaves develop masses of orange spores, which infect other ribes nearby, expanding the exposure. These are followed by brown hair-like growths on the underleaf that give off spores that infect the pines, starting the cycle all over again. The cycle can take 3 to 6 years, depending on weather conditions, so it's always a potential attacker.
What can be done to interrupt the cycle? With the cedar apple rust, it can be kept down with manual controls like pruning. What methods have been used to control the white pine blister rust? Doesn't the fact that there are 5 stages give them more opportunity of control?
Well, one concerted effort was made to eradicate alternate host, ribes, the gooseberry, and the currant plants. The federal government banned growth of gooseberries and currants in 1911. And in 1966, states were allowed to opt in or out of the ban. New York didn't lift the ban until 2003. What's going on now?
There has been a move among the timber industry to designate risk zones and to prune lower branches of the pines so that the spores can't reach them. And as far as the ribes family is concerned, New York State is reviving the commercial growing of red and black currants in disease-resistant varieties. New York State Ag and the Markets is spearheading the revival industry. Do you know that currants have 4 times as much vitamin C as oranges and twice as much antioxidants as blueberries?
That's all we have to say today. Thanks for listening, and we'll be talking to you again soon. Please go to ccecolumbiagreen.org for additional information. Thank you, and goodbye.
You're listening to Nature Calls, conversations from the Hudson Valley. Stay tuned for Patch to Plate.
Hi, and welcome. If you've been listening to the podcast episodes, you've heard from Teresa Golden talking about the veggie patch. Now we're moving from patch to plate. Today we're going to talk about highlighting ingredients from the home garden or farmer's market or even the grocery store and using them in your home kitchen. I'm Annie Scibienski, a Master Gardener Volunteer with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties. Today we're going to focus on good storage winter vegetables, familiar favorites, carrots and beets, particularly golden beets. These vegetables are really easy to grow. You can put them in the ground as soon as it can be worked, usually around April 15th. They tolerate light frost, so they're good veggies to get in the ground early. And they're slow to germinate, so you can put in a row of radishes along with the beets and carrots, and they'll grow, break the soil crust, and get the ground really ready for when the carrots and beets are ready to sprout. These root vegetables you can hear more about in Podcast 38, Teresa's Veggie Patch segment, and growing guides are on our website. This time of year, carrots and beets are both readily available in our area. Because they're so easy to peel and chop and shred and roast and puree and freeze, they can be easily incorporated into a lot of recipes, and we've included in the show notes information on how to select and store and cook them, as well as some nutritional information. I'll start with the carrots. Carrots love butter, ginger, lemon, maple syrup, orange juice, and sugar, and they're also pretty fond of cinnamon, dill, mint, and salt. So when you're looking for a recipe, say, for your carrots, look to see if these other ingredients are also part of the recipe, because if so, it may be a well thought out recipe and increase the chances that you'll have a successful outcome. Let's talk about maple-glazed carrots. There's a full recipe and the link in our show notes, but let's talk about the general approach. Peel the carrots and cut them into chunks of about 1.5 inches. We're going to roast them until tender in olive oil. I use olive oil cooking spray. It's a little bit lighter. So preheat the oven to 400. At about 400 Fahrenheit, these are going to take 20 minutes to roast, roughly. If you're using your oven for other items, you can roast these carrots at 375 to 425. Any place in that range will do it. The cooking time will vary, obviously, depending on how hot the oven is. So put them in, keep an eye on them. While they're roasting, whisk together a glaze of maple syrup, balsamic vinegar, and a little Dijon mustard. When tender, pull the pan out of the oven, pour the glaze on it, and stir around. You want to coat the veggies. Put them back in the oven for another 3 to 5 minutes. This is going to make a great side dish with almost any main dish. Root vegetables and winter squashes have a couple things in common. They're good storing vegetables. They're readily available in our area, and they love roasting, which intensifies their natural sweetness. Because they share these characteristics, they're easy to swap for each other. If you've got a butternut squash recipe, you could use sweet potatoes or carrots instead. You could use any of the above as a substitution for pumpkin, say. Feel free, if you have a recipe you like, to substitute one for the other. You may come up with a new family favorite. Ready for dessert? We're going to have Hidden Beet pound cake. It's hard to detect the beets once the cake's actually made. The approach is to take a basic cake recipe that includes flour, baking soda, salt, eggs, and oil and replace the usual milk or water with pureed beets. Your setup for success includes preheating the oven, getting all the ingredients out of the cupboard so you make sure you have them, preparing a 9x5 loaf pan. Details are in the recipe and that link is in our show notes. But it's a simple approach. Mix all your dry ingredients together in one bowl, your wet ingredients together in another. Add dry to wet until just combined. You don't want to overmix it because mixing creates gluten and that makes the final cake tough. Once you have it all together, I want you to do a batter check. By this I mean just tip the bowl slightly toward you. The batter should also move toward you. If it doesn't, if it stays where it is, add a tablespoon, remix. If necessary, a second tablespoon of water and remix. When you tip the bowl, you want the batter to flow toward you. You want the consistency of a pancake batter, for example, something that you can ladle. Once your batter passes its check, get it into the pan, pour it in, and then use a spatula to scrape it in. Put the pan in your preheated oven. Because of the high moisture content in this recipe, it's going to take a while to bake. So set the timer for 65 minutes and check it then. It may take as long as 75. When it's done, insert a toothpick in the center of the loaf pan and it should come out cleanly. Let the cake cool completely before slicing. See the beets? No, they're hidden. For these and more nutritious recipes, head to the nutrition page at our Cornell website. Enjoy. That's it for this edition of From Patch to Plate. I'm Annie Scibienski.
That concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank Sandra Linnell and Devin Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at columbiagreenmgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acra. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities